Hello, how are you all? I hope you all had a wonderful, wonderful week. Tonight, I continue to ask the Lord to bless each one of you with His love, joy, and peace. And last week, we studied chapter 11 of Exodus and the first 12 verses of chapter 12. And we mentioned that God gave instruction to Moses so he can pass it on to the children of Israel about the departure from Egypt, and especially how to preserve the life, actually how to preserve the firstborn's life from the coming judgment. Each family, alone or in connection with a neighbor, was to kill a lamb or baby goat that is without blemish, and with a bunch of hyssop sprinkle the blood of the lamb goat on the two side posts and on the upper doorposts of the house, so that when the destroying angel coming at midnight, he will not enter the house. And they were to eat the flesh roasted, which is the lamb or the goat as a whole, without cutting into pieces, and with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. And when the night arrives, God told Moses, with your loin girded, your shoes on your feet, and your staff in your hand, you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. Now let's continue with verse 14. This is still the instruction from the Lord to Moses. So this is the day you are to commemorate. For the generation to come, you shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord, a lasting ordinance. For 7 days you are to eat bread made without yeast. On the first day remove the yeast from your houses. For whoever eats anything with yeast in it, from the first day through the 7th must be cut off from Israel. On the first day hold the sacred assembly, and another one on the 7th day. Do no work at all on these days, except to prepare food for everyone to eat. That is all you may do. 17. Celebrate the festival of unleavened bread, because it was on this very day that I brought your divisions out of Egypt. Celebrate this day as the lasting ordinances for the generations to come. Again, he reiterates in more detail. In the first month, you are to eat bread made without yeast, from the evening of the 14th day until the evening of the 21st day. For 7 days, no yeast is to be found in your houses. And anyone, whether foreigner or native born, who eats anything with yeast, it must be cut off from the community of Israel. Eat nothing made with yeast. Wherever you live, you must eat unleavened bread. So the instruction here is that they are to assemble together on the first day of Passover and the last day of Passover. And during the 7 days, they are not to work except to prepare food. And then there are 3 different instructions here from God in regard to yeast. And number 1 is eat bread without yeast. Number 2, on the first day, remove the yeast from your houses. And this refers to the sourdough starter used to leaven their doughs. So in the olden days, that's how they make the bread rice, right? Bread dough rice. And number 3, the instruction says, whoever eats anything with yeast, they must be cut off from Israel. That means that any food that has yeast, that they cannot have. And then the conclusion verse, which is verse 20, also emphasizes that no yeast. So no yeast, no yeast, no yeast. So it's very important. So what's wrong with yeast? Well, yeast, sometimes called leaven, is often symbolic of sin in the Bible. You can see in Luke chapter 12, verse 1, and 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 6 and 8. And Paul tells the Corinthians that they have been delivered from the yeast, which is bondage of malice and evil, by the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, the Passover lamb. And now do you see the connection between yeast, sin, Passover lamb, and the sacrifice of Jesus? Furthermore, eating unleavened bread is also a reminder to Israelites of the quick exodus. See, it is faster to make bread without yeast, right? And the deliverance happened so quickly that There was no time to use yeast to allow the bread to rise before they hit the road. So, has the Passover festival been kept for generations as God had instructed them? Is there proof to that? You know, the earliest reference outside the Bible to an observance of Passover comes from an Aramaic letter addressed to the Jewish community on the Nile island of Elephantine in Egypt. It dates to around 420 BC and refers to a 7-day observance of what appears to be Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Remember, Passover festival and unleavened bread festival are the same. And we know the Jews are still commemorating this festival. So we know that the tradition has been passing down generations after generations. Just a side note, the present day Passover kept by the Jews, they don't use a whole lamb anymore since 70 AD after the destruction of the temple. Because after the destruction, there's no way to properly sacrifice a lamb or anything else. So most of the time, they would eat just the lamb shank instead. But I read that the Samaritans still keep the same thing. They would still roast the whole lamb or the goat during Passover. The central theme or the verse of this passage tells the reason for the celebration, because it was on this very day that God brought Israelites out of Egypt. Now, verse 21. Then Moses summoned all the elders of Israel and said to them, "Go at once and select the animals for your families and slaughter the Passover lamb. Take a bunch of hyssop, dip it into blood in the basin, and put some of the blood on the top and in both sides of the doorframe. None of you shall go out of the door of your house until morning. When the Lord goes through the land to strike down the Egyptians, he will see the blood on the top and the sides of the doorframe and will pass over that doorway, and he will not permit the destroyer to enter your houses and strike you down." 24. Obey these instructions as a lasting ordinance for you and your descendants. When you enter the land that the Lord will give you, as he promised, observe this ceremony. And when your children ask you, "What does this ceremony mean to you?" then tell them, "It is a Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt and spared our homes when he struck down the Egyptians." Then the people bowed down and worshipped. The Israelites did just what the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron. Well, God instructed Moses, and now Moses instructed people. "Go at once," Moses said. Well, there was an urgency in this matter, and this is the first time Moses speaks to them since they refused to listen to them 6 chapters ago. You remember that? In chapter 6, verse 9. And now they have experienced God's protection during the plague. And so, unlike before, they are now listening attentively. They listen because Moses was giving them crucial, important direction for the protection of the firstborn, and also instruction for the future remembrance of this event. He told them to choose the animal for their families, slaughter Passover lamb, mark blood on the top and both sides of the doorframe, and he told them to use hyssop to put some of the blood on the house. And Moses assured the people of the Lord's intention is to protect them. And the Lord came to strike down the Egyptian, and he would protect them with his passing over. And the Lord would do this when he see the family had obeyed him. That means they accept his lordship. So, do we Christians observe the Passover? Yes. We are still observing it, but somewhat differently. Remember what the Gospel Mark told us? It tells us the first day, actually in chapter 14, on the first day of Passover, Jesus told his disciples to prepare the upper room for the Passover. And then from verses 22 to 25, Jesus demonstrated and gave an instruction to his disciple of how to observe the Passover feast from that time forward, which is the unleavened bread. Eat the unleavened bread that symbolize his body, and drink the cup which symbolize his blood. And now we call it the Lord's Supper, right? You can read it in Mark chapter 14, verse 12 to 16, Matthew 26, 17 to 19, and Luke 22, 7 to 13. And besides the gospel, Paul also tells the Christians that they have been delivered from the yeast, which is bondage of sin, by the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, the Passover lamb. And then Paul again in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 23 to 26, he further explained the Lord's Supper. So the theme Passover is not only meaningful for the Jews, but also for us. For us is to remember God's protection of us from the bondage of sin, death, and evil through the blood of Jesus Christ, the Lamb of God. Also to look forward for the future when God's people will be delivered permanently from this world that has kept us in bondage of sin. You know, the instruction for later Passover never again mentioned the blood of the lamb to put on the door frame. You can look at it in Numbers chapter 9. Since it was only a one-time event of difference, what does it mean for us Christian? For Christian, this feature of Passover is also like Christ's once and for all defeat of death through his blood in death and in resurrection. It's once and for all. So how did the people respond? At the first opportunity to respond, the people bowed down and worshiped. Not because Moses and Aaron were persuasive, but it was because they had witnessed God's mighty power and his mercy. And they worshiped before even the final deliverance, so they now really believe in God. And they believe that God will follow through with his promises. Now, verse 29. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on the throne, to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and the firstborn of all the livestock as well. Pharaoh and all his officials and all the Egyptians got up during the night, and there was loud wailing in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. During the night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "Up, leave my people. You and Israelite, go worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks and herds as you have said, and go, and also bless me." The Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the country, for otherwise, they said, we all will die. And so the people took the dough before the yeast was added and carried it on their shoulders in kneading troughs, wrapped in cloths. The Israelites did as Moses instructed and asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and for clothing. And the Lord made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people. And they gave them what they asked for. So they plundered the Egyptians. So the night of the Exodus came. After these lengthy plagues and speeches and extensive instruction for the Passover and Feast of Unleavened Bread observance, now the reality began. So what happened? Number one, the Lord struck the firstborn in Egypt, and loud wailing was heard in every house, and all the Egyptians got up during the night. Number two, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron in the middle of the night and told them, "Up, leave, go, worship, serve the Lord. Take your flocks and go, as you have requested." And he had a last request. He said, "And also bless me." So why bless him? You see, Pharaoh was the firstborn too. Number three, the people hurried with their bread because the Egyptian people urged them to hurry up and leave the country. Because with someone dead in each house, they were afraid more would die if the Israelites would remain. Why were they so worried about the bread dough then in the midst of this havoc? Well, it shows God's care for the details that the people need the daily bread. So the people were simply following God's instructions. Number 4, as instructed Israelite asked the Egyptian for articles of silver and gold and for clothing, the Egyptian graciously gave them what they asked for. And we mentioned that last week that according to Deuteronomy, at the time of release, all slave owners were asked to provide material goods to the slaves as they begin their new lives. And so this is the beginning of that tradition. And furthermore, God instructed them to ask for those items because later on they would need these items to build the tabernacle. And we could see that in chapter 38 of Exodus. And the word plunder sounds so terrible, but actually in Hebrew means delivered from enemy. Now verse 37. The Israelites journeyed from Ramses to Succoth. There were about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. Many other people went up with them, and also large droves of livestock, both flocks and herds. With the dough the Israelites had brought from Egypt, they baked loaves of unleavened bread. The dough was without yeast, because they had been driven out of Egypt and did not have time to prepare food for themselves. Now the length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of 430 years, to the very day, all the Lord's division left Egypt, because the Lord kept vigil that night to bring them out of Egypt. On this night, all the Israelites are to keep vigil to honor the Lord for the generations to come. So they exited Ramesses to Succoth. Succoth appears to be a region on Egypt's eastern border with several military outposts there. Traveling there suggests that they were heading toward Sinai Peninsula. And you see here in the passage, many other people went up with them. In other version in the Bible, it says a mixed multitude, indicates there were other people besides the Israelites. Scholars are quite sure that some of the Hebrews, like Joseph, intermarried Egyptians. Therefore, the mixed multitude or the many other people, quite possibly that they're Egyptians and perhaps even some other Semites. Furthermore, according to Jewish tradition, in her later years, Pharaoh's daughter devotes herself to Moses and to Yahweh. She celebrates the first Passover Seder with Moses in the slaves' quarters, and for that, her firstborn survived the final of the 10 plagues of Egypt. And does the Bible has any record of that? Well, it has a little bit. Well, let's read 1 Chronicles 4:18, and this is Judah's genealogy. Okay, so in the beginning, his wife Jehudiah bore Jared, the father of Jedor, Heber, the father of Sakol, and Jekuthiel, the father of Janoah, and these were the sons of Bethia, the daughter of Pharaoh, whom Mered took. Well, so that's a little bit about Pharaoh's daughter here, right? You can see. And we answered the question from last week whether any Egyptian had a chance to escape the last plague, even though the Pharaoh had decided to resist the offer of mercy. Let's move on. The passage said there were 600,000 men went out with Moses. This number only included men. So if we add children and women, it probably adds up to 2 million according to biblical scholar. So the Hebrew lived in Egypt for 430 years, fulfilling what God had told Abraham years ago. And you can look at that in Genesis chapter 15, verse 13. Now, verse 43. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "These are the regulations for the Passover meal. No foreigners may eat it. Any slave you have brought may eat it after you have circumcised him. But a temporary resident or hired worker may not eat it. It must be eaten inside the house. Take none of the meat outside the house. Do not break any of the bones. The whole community of Israel must celebrate it. A foreigner residing among you who wants to celebrate the Lord's Passover must have all the males in his household circumcised. Then he may take part like one born in the land. No uncircumcised male may eat it. The same law applies both to the native born and to the foreigner residing among you. All the Israelites did just what the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron. And on that very day, the Lord brought the Israelites out of Egypt by their divisions. These verses return to the concern of perpetual keeping the Passover. We see that God doesn't want his children to forget what he has done for them. So of these 7 laws, 5 concern who should or should not share in the Passover meal. Number 1, no foreigners should eat of it. A temporary resident and a hired worker may not eat of it. And this 2 category refers to people who have not joined the community of faith, but who are temporarily associated with it. Number 3, the whole community of Israel must celebrate it. Number 4, enslaved may eat of it after they have been circumcised. Number 5, an alien living among them who wants to celebrate the Lord's Passover must have all their males in his household circumcised. Then he may take part like one that is born in the land. And these are the people who had joined the community permanently, not temporarily. Number 6, it must be eaten inside the house. And this means that whatever home one began to eat this Passover meal in, one must stay in it. And number 7, don't break any of the bones of the animal. And the passage ends with the report that all the Israelites obey this command from the very first observance. So in summary, Exodus chapter 12 teach us contemporary people some timely lessons. Number 1, obedient to God. Just as the Israelites followed God's instruction for the Passover, we are reminded of the importance of obeying God's commands in our lives, even when they may seem unusual or difficult. Number 2, trusting God's protection. By trusting in God's promise of protection, even in the face of daunting challenges, we learn to rely on his faithfulness and provision in our own lives. Number 3, symbolism of redemption. The Passover lamb symbolizes Jesus Christ, whose sacrifice brings redemption and salvation to believers. And this reminds us of the central role of Christ's sacrifice in our faith. Number 4, community and remembrance. The communal nature of the Passover celebration highlights the importance of shared rituals and remembrance in our spiritual life, fostering unity and reinforcing our collective identity as followers of God. Number 5, freedom from bondage. The story of Israelite liberation from slavery in Egypt served as a powerful reminder of God's ability to deliver us from various forms of bondage and oppression, offering hope and encouragement in times of struggle. Overall, Exodus chapter 12 encourages to faithfully follow God, trust in his protection, remember his redemptive act, and find strength and hope in his deliverance. Happy Sabbath.